Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome to Blueprints. Can you introduce yourself, please? Dalia, can you go first?
For sure. I'm Dalia Awwad. I'm a member of the Legal Support Committee. I'm a Palestinian organizer based here in Toronto.
And I'm Rachelle Friesen. I'm also part of the Legal Support Committee for those that have been criminalized for Palestine solidarity and located here in Toronto.
For those that have been criminalized for Palestinian solidarity, that is a growing number, is it not? And we don't even just measure that by the amount of arrests that we're going to talk about and the treatment by the Toronto police and the media and whatnot, but just the act of criminalization and the language of criminalization just absolutely surrounds Palestinian solidarity work, doesn't it? And just the way you phrase that, I imagine that you've got your hands full then, if that's what you folks are doing. Rachelle, can you maybe give me an idea of the scope? Because let's just set the stage. I'm on Twitter, X, whatever, and I'm getting enraged. There's folks out there trying to imply that the police haven't cracked down on all of these disruptive protests and terrorist supporters. They're very upset about this, that not enough resources have been spent policing you folks. I imagine you've got something to say about that. You want to give us a broad idea of just what Toronto police have been doing in relation to Palestinian solidarity work?
Sure. I think when we talk about criminalization, the first arrest took place on October 30th, 2023, and 13 people were arrested and given trespass tickets on that day. There's been a few other trespass tickets since then, but we don't actually count them because really that has not been the trend moving forward. That's sort of like the first and last day we really got trespass tickets. After that day, everything escalated to charges. So since October 30th, TPS has arrested and charged 93 people. Now, some of them have been charged twice for like two different events, who we lovingly call two-timers, and some of them have multiple charges for the same event. So we don't actually know the total number of charges laid against arrestees, but that number, because that number would be far larger than 93. So that's just the very basic numbers. And I think at first when, like I said, arrests happened, it started with the trespass, and then within a couple of weeks, it moved to folks getting a lot of mischief charges. And then it went to like mischief or unlawful assembly while wearing a mask. And most recently, it has moved towards assault of a cop. Those seem to be the most frequent charges. And so that's sort of how it's progressed in terms of the last year, in terms of charges. And I think otherwise, in terms of trends, when we started off in the fall, most arrests were happening on site.
Which makes sense for a trespass charge, right?
Yeah. And then what we see come January, and I would say this also happens as the hate crimes unit gets more funding, because they get an increase of funding as well in January, and you get the surveillance structure coming in on top of the city. In January, we start to see an increase in phone calls and people getting called to turn themselves in after the fact. And then come March, phone calls seem to be very predominant. And then what we start to see is, before perceived escalations of actions, we have an increase of those phone calls. So like ahead of April 15th, where there was an international call out for escalation, we had 3 people get arrested. At the beginning of May, when everyone was wondering, will there be an encampment? Is the encampment starting? U of T is putting up fencing. But is there an encampment happening? And the week where that is suspected to happen, we get the phone calls of 3 different people from 3 different events to turn themselves in as well. And we have seen that throughout. So we knew, as the Legal Support Committee, end of September, beginning of October is going to be a sweep of people. And I think it's what we had. And so we grew our committee at that time so we would be able to provide more support. But those are some of the trends we're seeing, and I'll hand it to Dalia for things that I might have missed in that trends and in that data.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you've missed anything. I mean, I think one piece I'll add on is the conditions that we've seen for folks. So those have kind of escalated as well.
Bail conditions?
Bail conditions, yes. So after folks have had charges laid against them, their bail conditions have escalated in nature. So we have conditions. Non-association has been relatively common for folks arrested together or for the same event, which means you cannot converse without the presence of counsel. And then we had some folks who had a protest ban placed on them as a condition, which then got dropped once their lawyers went to court because it's a clear violation of folks' charter rights. And then there are also regulations that are restrictions of being that arrestees cannot be 500 meters. They can't be within 500 meters of specific locations. So I think those are just, some of also the added forms of repression or, criminalization that people have faced. And often people's, attorneys will challenge conditions. Thus far, some non-association charges have been dropped, but not all. So, it's because of the large number of arrests, it varies.
I'm going to link a few episodes back to this one because we did talk to Ms. Squasson about her bail conditions and how they were impacting her based on her arrest. And we spoke with Anna Littman about the being charged while masked, adding that additional charge. So it's no wonder Rachelle says the number of charges is likely so much higher because we find cops or the Crown adding charges after arrest or, trying to just make the issue more complex than it is.
And just one thing to add, I feel like, Rachelle, maybe you've mentioned this or not, but I think we've also, one of the trends that we've tracked is a bit of public outcry related to how police respond to a thing. So how people respond on Twitter and what the Zionist response for that does impact that specific piece of how much criminalization folks protesting the genocide receive. And I think that's also a piece of TPS's interests being very closely linked to folks that have power and hold capital and hold power. And so, I don't think this is shocking to say that the police's interests are not those of the general public, but those of capitalist interests and the state itself.
It's not shocking, but I'm not sure we quite think of their actions being dictated in the same way politicians are. I think we forget that. We assume, although they are an oppressive tool of the state, the fact that they are led by public outcry just for us, I think sometimes just doesn't jive with us because no matter how much public outcry we seem to make, there doesn't seem to be the same response. But I want to unpack a few of the things that you folks have mentioned. And although it's maddening to hear the escalation of police tactics, clearly they saw, trespassing charges were not going to deter anyone. And then mischief charges were not deterring anyone, even when we pair that with really oppressive bail conditions and, holding them for 24 hours, taking them to separate stations. They tried all kinds of things to just make it as stressful as possible. Not just on any activists. They're typically organizers, folks who are leading these actions or planning them or, allegedly doing what they're doing. And so it's very tactical on their behalf, but it also is a sign of how relentless the movement has been, right? Because surely, well, maybe folks should answer this, but do you feel like it has had the effect the police are looking for? Because now you're at the point where folks are getting charged with assaulting police officers. That is a completely different charge, right? It looks different in print. The consequences are much more severe. Also, it's my understanding that all of these charges are also being investigated for hate crimes. And publicly so. We are also investigating these for hate crimes is the phrase that will actually come out of the police officer or the police release, and it'll accompany the name, age of those charged. I think it's important to note at this point, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, no one has been convicted of any of these charges.
And I think that's like when we talk about there's like the psychological element, there's the physical element of people getting beaten by the police, and then there's also the material part. So like the fact that anyone that's arrested in support of Palestine gets investigated by the hate crimes unit, and that gets published through TPS, and then it just gets regurgitated by mainstream media. Now, no one has been convicted, but what that does effectively do is it creates an atmosphere where doxing can happen. So people then getting tormented online, people have had their employer called, people have lost their jobs. This is all, I would say, very intentional. I know, so for example, I was arrested at some point. I know there was a press release that came out that said it's being investigated by the hate crimes unit. I had to tell my employer this. Now, I'm very lucky that my employer supports me, but that's not a comfy thing to do, to be like, I'm being investigated. You should know this is what's happening and this is how it's going to be spun. And while the state has continued to try to escalate, either through listing charges online, weird charges. Someone the other day was arrested for taking a flag off a vehicle, and somehow that made mainstream media. An Israeli flag off of a vehicle, and that somehow made mainstream media. But what it's trying to do is completely dehumanize this movement that is ultimately trying to stop a genocide, right? And I think the state keeps thinking the harder they crack down, the more they surveil us, the more they harass us, we're going to be scared into our homes to not do anything. But there is a genocide going on. I do not see people slowing down. I do not see people stopping. Because the ultimate struggle is to stop the genocide and what is going on in Palestine and in Lebanon. And to that, people are just going to continue.
Yeah, and I think I will also, just to build off of that, I think there's something to be said about the mask falling more intensely or purposefully or what have you, more starkly when it comes to the Canadian state. And the Canadian state is a settler colonial project, and its loyalties are with the settler colonial state of Israel. And you see that very clearly, like the TPS's intended punishment is because the earlier forms of escalations they had against people who were protesting this genocide were not deterrents. They did not serve the purpose. They had it so they kept escalating in the hopes that would make people stay home and hide and be afraid. But like Rachelle said, like the stakes are so high. The stakes are either a genocide continues or we put a stop to the genocide. And so when people look at it that way, they don't want, like, even folks from who've been arrested and who are dealing with these charges and who we've spoken to as the legal support committee, they're not deterred. On the contrary, they want to highlight the insanity of what has been the media coverage of this and what has been the TPS response to this. People have been so severely doxxed that for a few individuals, their addresses have been shared online, like their home addresses. And these are people who have not been charged of anything. Like you said, nobody's been convicted. And so, I think it's showing very clearly that the media regurgitates what the police is saying right now. And we've been kind of entering a place where the media is refusing to do its due diligence to ask the side of the arrestees or the side of people in the movement who are doing this work. And they have received, I think prior to October 7th, the Toronto police chief did a whole presser about like the quote unquote effectiveness and TPS. And that's the thing, like TPS is using this criminalization to show its effectiveness when in reality it has not been a deterrent. And in response, there was a statement that was put out that was debunking all the lies that he put out. And there was a media contact person put out with that release, and the media did not pick it up at all. And they ran with the TPS's false narratives, even though there were parts of it that were lies. And that's often the case. And I think we've seen that, at one point after the March 30th protest of Land Day, when, TPS brutality was in full display, because people on the ground were covering it and taking videos, the media covered it well with the press conference that came after. And then from that point onwards, it was like there was, my assumption, not backed by anything, is there was some type of unspoken directive of do not cover anything unless it comes from a police officer's mouth. And that is what we have seen. The fact that the media hasn't covered the fact that there are protest ban conditions is wild. Like, you'd think they'd run with that, but instead they're running with the flag story. And so, like, the fact that they ran with the narrative that somebody was trying to flee the country when that wasn't the case is also wild. Like, they just keep running with these stories. And then a good example, a recent one, is like on September 11th, when there was the violence outside of police station. The only reason the media began to cover that was because police reported quote unquote minor injuries when we had 8 people go to hospital with serious injuries. So just to say that, like, it's not that the tactics are not working as intended. They're having the opposite effect on the movement, because people can very clearly see that the Toronto police are the arm of the state, and the state is a settler colonial state that will not do anything willingly. There is no appealing to the morality of settler colonial states. And so I think, like, an unfortunate silver lining is that the brutality has and attempts at criminalization have highlighted that so clearly at this point in time, particularly a year into this.
And I think, just to jump off of that, there was this amazing press conference that really spoke back to the violence that was received on Land Day. And again, since then, it's been silent. We did a criminalization of dissent press conference on June 17th. It was beautiful. It was amazing. We got no coverage from it. There were 2 other press conferences this summer, specifically around TPS, either doing consultation or their tactics. We might get a camera there, but it won't go to air. We have written statements that, for example, there was a press conference around the Indigo Kills Kids, and we brought up the beating at 51 Division and state repression. Like, what's happening with Indigo is just an extension of this whole state. Anything that criticizes TPS has been very, very hard to get into the media, which is why we're starting to ask a lot of questions. Because the 51 Division beating was one of the biggest police beatings of the public, and that is who we are. We are the public. There were hundreds of people outside 51 Division. It was the biggest police beating of the public since the beating at Lamport Stadium back in the summer of 2021. And who covered it? And instead, what we are seeing is these manipulations, right, of situations. So they have their TPS press release. Then you have media just regurgitate it, maybe change a few words around, word for word. And that's where you also get, for example, back in May at the encampment, there was a marshal that was arrested at the encampment, and the Toronto Star originally published, now they eventually changed it, information from the press release about how this person had been previously charged in January over the overpass. But what they didn't include was that person's charges were dropped because the judge had said that there was not enough evidence to convict this person. And yet they didn't publish that part. In the media's mind and in TPS, what they did was oh, this person's at the encampment. See, not only did they cause problems here, they caused problems back in January, and publish what they were charged with, but not that there was no stance for that. Or you think about, in terms of my arrest, I was arrested I was arrested at the airport. I did not know there was a warrant out for my arrest. I was going to the US for 2 days to visit a colleague of mine. It was US immigration that informed me of my arrest and handed me over to TPS. And what does DemQ do? He makes a statement saying this person was left trying to leave the country. Which then CTV originally ran with this person was trying to flee the country. Now we got a retraction printed on that because I was very angry. But this is the manipulations that are happening.
So yeah, like when you folks say people aren't deterred, that isn't to say they aren't really impacted. Like I don't want, and I never want to scare people away from doing that work, and I'm so glad to hear that people aren't. But this has real psychological impact on people, not and material. You've already mentioned people are losing their jobs. We've heard folks having to change addresses, for the very reasons you've talked about, either doxing or never knowing when the cops are looking in at them. And this, let's talk a little bit more about the tactics, too, that play into that psychological impact. Let's talk about the turn-ins to start, because there's going to be listeners who have no idea what that is. You mentioned it just briefly when you were talking about the trends, how they used to arrest people on site, and now we're finding, sometimes months later. So you've gone to a pretty innocuous action, a sit-in perhaps, with a mask on, and months later, right as you're in the thick of organizing an escalated action, likely, right? The cops know these significant dates for us. You are starting to get phone calls to turn yourself in. And Rachelle, when I spoke to you earlier, you told me about these turn-ins, and, cops don't have a warrant to come get you. They'll say, come turn yourself in. And at first I say, are people listening to them? Because I was just like, fuck you, come get me. But I'm in a different circumstance. Okay, so that was me not really thinking of other people in that moment. I said, are people actually listening? And you're like, well, yeah, because the alternative is when they do get a warrant, or you might not even know and you're at the airport, or they'll come to your work to pick you up instead, which is hella awkward. Or maybe they'll come at like 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning and kick the door in, like we've seen. And so can you explain a little bit about what leads up to these requests to turn-ins? And just, you did a great job, either one of you, just maybe you've experienced it yourself, but to give folks an idea of what people experience before they actually get arrested or turn themselves in.
I can maybe start us off. And I think also just kind of to what you're saying, like, yes, people aren't deterred. And like you said, people are feeling the impacts of this. Like Rachelle said, it's psychological, it's physical, it's material. Like these things should not be, I can't even think of the word in this moment, but like they should not be under categorized or made light of, because those impacts are very real, and the punishment that the state is trying to impose on people is very severe, and that is the point. So with the turn-ins, I think there are different ways in which we've seen like TPS surveillance and harassment taking place, against people protesting this genocide. One of them, when we have asks for turn-ins, there's the Toronto police calling folks on the phone, asking them, saying like, come in, we have a warrant for you. We want to arrest you for this specific thing. And what they will have is a Form 10. And a Form 10 is what you get when you are released, and leaving post having had charges laid against you. And what the police should be doing is getting a warrant for your arrest and then giving you a Form 10. So the police are skipping a step and willy-nilly doing whatever they want because they can get away with it. And people don't always have, there's been
I don't know what a Form 10 is. I have no fucking clue.
And that's the thing, like the distinction between the two is something that we've been working on educating folks like in the movement about, because educating the public about it, because you wouldn't know that when police come door knocking at your house or when they call you on the phone, that you should ask, like, do you have a warrant for my arrest? And that's the first question you should ask. And someone had a really great response for that when the police door knocked them, is and Rachelle was on the phone with them as this was happening, but they knocked on their door and the person asked the police, do you have a warrant? And the police were like, dancing around the question. They're like, it's a yes or no question. I was going to say,
they're lying, right? They're like, what if they just say yes? And you're like, oh, okay.
They have to show you the warrant, you know? You have to say,
it's like the movies.
Exactly. And so if they don't have a warrant, really, you can like make them get the warrant. This is their job. But sometimes it makes sense because like people don't want to wait for the warrant. If you have kids in your house and you don't want the police to raid your home, that's a real concern. Like it can be very traumatizing for folks who've had their homes raided in the hours of like during dawn, early morning, 5 a.m., 6 a.m. Their kids were traumatized as they saw parents cuffed, or parents were traumatized as they saw kids cuffed and brutalized. And so
for postering indigo.
Not just indigo. So we've had home raids outside of that as well, where it was like the children like being arrested in the home and the parents being forced to sit as this entire raid was happening in their home. And so like it's been for different, forms of protest that have happened, but just to say that it'll come much later, it'll be a scare tactic and a form to harass you. And sometimes it's a type of information gathering because they don't really like getting a warrant is having a judge say that, yes, there's enough here to charge this person with these things. Whereas without that, you're saying like the police are making the decisions on their own. So I think those are some of the distinctions to be made, is like, they're operating with quite a bit of free range and they're like running with it, and asking those questions is kind of trying to have your own back a little bit, but it's not to say that they won't get a warrant later. It's just to say that like, if you have the ability to wait, and there is also quite a bit of anxiety and stress and depression and hypervigilance that's associated with waiting on a warrant, because as you like, they don't care about you. They're not going to like, with Rachelle, for example, they did not inform her when a warrant was issued for her arrest. So they're like really trying to fuck with people, and it works because leaving people in a precarious state where they don't know where they stand, like once you've been charged with a thing, things start moving forward. But if it's hanging over your head as a this may or may not happen, this may happen after the action, or it may happen 3 months in advance, you're leaving people in the movement in a perpetual state of anxiety and stress, and that's intentional because you never you never know what's going to come of it. And so, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and pass it over to Rachelle. I know I went on for quite a bit of time.
Well, I was just going to say, like, and I think that's also sort of like part of design of their plan, right? So like, it is our right to wait for an arrest warrant, which sounds strange to say in and of itself. But like executing that right to wait until you have an arrest warrant will create additional anxiety and stress in your house or in your home, when already there is the whole entire surveillance of the state. So like people have reported to us of police cars parked outside of their buildings or outside of their homes, of suspected police vehicles. People have been followed home from protests. People have been followed going for a walk in the park. People have been followed going about their daily life or have experienced harassment either because they're being followed, or like you go for a drink downtown and you walk out of the bar and what do you know, there's somebody there from a bike cop from 52 is on his beat and he recognizes you from a protest. So why wouldn't he take the opportunity to harass you on a Friday night? Like the violence that is like the psychological pressure and the violence that the TPS is trying to enact on us, it's very intimate at this point. They're outside of our homes. They are inside of our homes sometimes. They are calling us. They are door knocking us. They are following us. They are yelling our names out from their cars as we walk down the street. But again, it's not stopping us. We are going to keep going. And I think it's also just really important to highlight in these moments. And this is like part of abolition, right? Is the strength of the community, right? So like 93 arrests. We have a community of people, and we've been in touch with every single one. And if we aren't in touch with them for whatever reasons, we're in touch with their family members to make sure they are okay. People are showing up for each other to do jail support. People are showing up, like I've said before, like gift cards for food delivery. You don't generally cash them in; you just send them along in other directions. Like
To the
the
next person who
community
gets
love,
picked up.
yeah, the community love is like we know we are on our own in this city. We know we're getting doxxed. We know we can be doxxed online. We know we can get harassed in the street. We know people are getting death threats as well in the movement. And it is very clear, as we all know, the police do not keep us safe. In fact, they are the leading cause of us being unsafe. But we have built such a strong community of love and support where nobody is left behind.
Can we please talk more about the support pods? Because when you talked about them before, that was the real silver lining to the discussion. Because as you're talking about all of this, like my blood is boiling and I'm making faces. How come I'm going, oh, I'm so mad hearing all of this. But this isn't to scare people again, right? We do want to air this stuff. But before we get to the support pods, I want to go back to that paranoia a little bit. Because, hearing Rachelle, it sounds like paranoia to somebody who is oblivious to what's going on, right? Like someone totally outside the movement who thinks cops are just the good guys still. They, I think, would be like, of course they're outside your house. You live in the city. There's cops everywhere. And, you're imagining it. And to a degree, that is part of it as well, right? So it's happening. You see it happening, but you can't ever even confirm it. Like some of them are phone calls. You're getting phone calls from cops or like they're yelling your name. But then there's those other times when then now you're looking at like every car sideways, and heaven forbid we start looking at each other sideways, because we've been picked up, and we know part of what they do when some people are picked up is try to turn them, and so, yeah, like the psychological impact that it has on the individual, but then how they're trying to make us change who we are and how we operate, right, into something we don't want to be. So rather than becoming paranoid and, ramping up security so tight that people can't enter the fray anymore, right, from the outside, you folks have found a solution of sorts, a mitigation, support pods. Tell me more. Tell us more about those, that community support that is so necessary under this kind of suppression.
I mean, I can, just one piece to add to like what you're saying. Like we have had several arrestees report that when they were in custody, they've been spoken to by Chris, who is a cop, inviting them to be a confidential informant and to quote unquote, let TPS know if their comrades are up to anything, or quote, if they hear of anything that could be a risk to public safety, end quote.
Wait, did you say Chris? Like, do we have, is his name Chris? Oh, he says know. We don't know.
His name is Chris. It's like the most.
Do we have a photo
name.
Of Chris?
We do not. And it's just like it's like the basic name that's picked, but it's been.
Oh,
Chris
it could be a different guy.
Okay,
I got you.
Yeah, like it could be like 5 different dudes being Chris, but anyways. So, and I will say that like, just I think one of the things to like. When we're looking at these tactics and these arrests, like one thing is to divide people in the movement doing this work and make them distrustful of one another and turn us on each other. Another piece is to isolate people and make them so they're in silos. And one thing that we, in the work that we do, is like we focus on movement lawyers, and there's a question of who is representing folks who've been arrested. And that's because all these charges are criminal charges. And some criminal lawyers' response to their clients is do not talk to anyone, do not say anything until this ends. And that is not the approach of a movement lawyer. And a movement lawyer will make sure that you are still surrounded by community and you are not isolated from the work that you are doing. That really is, for most of us, very important to us. Like we don't feel like we're happy to be sidelined and not be able to work to end this genocide. And that's not a thing that like sits well when the state is coming down on you to be like, and now I'm out. And so the support community is to make sure that we're bringing folks together who've been arrested and providing them the supports that they need. And so there are different supports that we provide for people. One is connecting them with attorneys. Another is connecting them with other arrestees, knowing and announcing, you know, that the only criteria here is that folks have been charged. So this isn't necessarily a secure type of setting, but when you talk to other people, you kind of combat the gaslighting that the state is putting us under. Because when you're like, oh, like this happened with me, or like so having those things can help kind of with the psychological impact that these things have. I think some people who've been arrested have been organizationally affiliated, so their organizations have had their backs, but then other folks have not been. And so we've tried to make sure that there are individuals around those people so they're not falling through the cracks. And so there isn't a question. Everyone's receiving support regardless of the social capital they may have. And another piece is, which is a gentle plug, if we may, is the Toronto Community Justice Fund, which is to support people materially. So if you have $5 to spare, please donate, because the money in that fund is going to arrestees. And for some people, it's covering their rent. For some people, it's replacing doors that have been knocked down for the police. And for others, it's helping with lawyer fees. So just to say that that's something that is really essential, because the material piece of all of this is, very, very present.
I just want to say, if you go in the show notes for this episode, that will be the top link under the reference materials that you see there for the Toronto Community Justice Fund. So we'll make it as easy as possible for folks to donate. Because I know, like, we don't want to talk about the material impact, because when you're talking about stopping a genocide, and it's the same thing when we talk about the impacts to activists, all of them have said the same thing, like as Rachelle did before we started recording. Like, I don't want it to be about me and my bail conditions. And when we're watching what we're watching, and we're, horribly inspired by the courage it takes to be in Gaza right now, and the people fighting as part of the resistance. And so it pales, it seems, to talk about it, but it's still real. It's still real. It could act as a deterrent if we didn't have these safeguards in place. But as I hear you describe it, and I don't know why it didn't occur to me earlier, it's like the Toronto police realize they are making like a tight-knit club of organizers that have been through hell and back and have endeared themselves to one another, and like that have come up with terms like two-timers, as though like you're an elder now as opposed to someone that needs to lay low and be ostracized because you've been criminally charged. And it's like it's having the opposite effect. I know it is having that real effect on people, but in general, they're just stoking the fire. And that happens as you delegitimize the state, right? They don't realize that their actions are actually fueling their demise. So this kind of planning, this kind of organizing is so important. Is there anything else you want to add about like the community supports that you do? Because it was hard to watch that 51 division beating that Rachelle talked about. That was jail support for a previous action. And we talk about that on the show. Like, you've got to do jail support. You've got to be there when your comrades are released. You have to be there while they're inside. Like, police need to know that there is people waiting for them to hold them accountable. And so that matters to them. It matters to the individuals inside. And so to see them come out and beat the people who were on jail support, that was really hard to see. Not that all of it isn't, but what other kinds of supports should people be prepared to have? Like maybe a spare room, a spare bed for the odd folks that need to relocate? Or is there anything else that you found yourself needing that maybe weren't so obvious to you at the beginning that you've had to kind of develop support systems for?
I mean, spare rooms, spare beds are always useful for folks, because even even if you're in a constant state of hypervigilance, it's not even necessarily that there is an actual threat, But if you can't actually calm your body down in the environment that you are in, we've often recommended to folks like just like go to a friend's for a couple, like
Pretend it's an
remove yourself
Airbnb.
from the situation so that when you come home, you can actually like know what is threat, what is not a threat. And I think like something that is is starting to be built is like people providing, because our movement is it's dynamic, it's not monolithic. We have healthcare practitioners in our movement, we have lawyers in our movement, we have mental health practitioners in our movement, and so we do have therapists that do pro bono therapy and debrief sessions for folks. um, we definitely have healthcare practitioners that will advise people on how to get documentation of injuries after something like 51 division. Um, and so, like, that's sort of like also part of the beauty of our movement is that there are so many skills and everyone is providing what they can as they can so that we can keep going. And yes, we've all aged a lot in the last year. We've all learned a lot in the last year. But none of us are sidetracked from what is actually happening, um, and the genocide that is happening, that needs to be stopped.
Yeah. And I think to build off that, like one piece that I would say is to folks is to like diversify their support. And by that, I mean, it's great to have one person that you're very close with, but talk to multiple people that you trust and love and who love you. Like if it's, don't like, and I say this because different people will say different things to you and they can help give you perspective. And that's always helpful. I also will say that like, it's a good grounding to know that like settler colonialism and the state are more brutal when we are effective, and they are not brutal in a vacuum. They have a vested material interest in supporting the genocide, and they're not going to let go of that material interest reluctantly. They're going to be made to let go of it. And so it's not a situation of like, I think we've used every possible way of framing why the Canadian complicity in this genocide needs to end. It's not about saying it better. It's not about like, it's been said, it's been made clear, like all these things have been done. The reason they're trying to also like do this is I think it's scary for the state to see, I think Palestine ends up being scary because it brings people in from various sectors. You have writers, you have artists, you have lawyers, you have mental health professionals, you have parents at the TDSB and the Peel District School Board and every district school board around mobilizing students in university. And it is showing that there is a united front against a settler colonial project. And so then it raises the question for the state of what does this mean for the settler colonial state of Canada? Because if everybody's uniting against the end of a settler colonial project in the Middle East, what will that mean for the structures that exist here? And what does that mean for the capitalist class that has been profiting off of Indigenous genocide here? And I think I realize I'm going broader than the TPS, but just to say that like the state is backing the TPS. Like I know we haven't really touched on Project Resolute and the coordination of RCMP with OPP, with TPS, with the federal government, with all the things. But just to say that like, settler colonial states are sinister, and the reason they use violence is because they can't fight ideas with anything more than violence, and that's what they're doing right now. And the insanity is the idea that they're fighting is that genocide is bad, which should be a no-brainer. Genocide is bad. Like don't do genocide. Anyways. And to the state, that's a controversial statement, which just is because it's a state that was built and is built upon genocide. So,
the reality is it isn't a controversial statement. It's what you just described behind it. And we have plans for the Canadian settler states, so no wonder they are afraid, because this is working up into exactly what we need for a political revolution, right? All the sectors coming together, working together, learning how to maneuver through these state institutions that are also adapting at the same time. So it's not even like a trial run. It really is a fight against imperialism largely, right? Like, I think at the beginning, I didn't want to correct Rachelle when she said, like, the ultimate thing is stopping the genocide. It was like, yes, that is the most pressing thing. But we know that will lead to so much more, right? Right? That we start to destroy the imperialist machine altogether. So the fact that they are seeing these parallels and understanding, and let's just hope everyone within the movement is understanding it too, right? Like that they're not just going to stop the genocide, they'll free Palestine, and then we will free ourselves, right?
Which is why we also see more crackdowns on like Indigenous protests here in Canada. So like on quote unquote, I know podcasters can't see this, but Canada Day, fuck that day. There was the protest that was where Indigenous folks traditionally go and walk to the water, and they were told that they would not be able to do that because of Palestinian protesters in the crowd. We saw this during River Run, where like Clutch My Pearls, children heard from Turtle Island to Palestine, occupation is a crime. And we're seeing increasing increasing crackdowns on Indigenous solidarity. There is even things like there was a protest back in August, which was a protest to be in solidarity with Tyler, who is Indigenous and shot by the police. And on Twitter, people said it was Palestine activists shutting the city down again. And so we're seeing this connection.
Because it's all the same shit disturbers everywhere. We can't keep track of the things we're trying to stop. And they don't understand solidarity, right? It's so perplexing for them that you act as one movement, right? They need to label it, and the most explosive label possible right now is Palestine. But Dalia, you brought up Project Resolute. It's not even in my notes to talk about, but I don't know why. I was like just so angry about TPS, and this is TPS, but it's grown beyond that from what I understand from previous discussions with people. Rachelle. Can we talk about how that, so folks might, was it The Breach? It was The Breach. The Breach, I believe it was The Breach, we'll link the article, wrote a piece on Project Resolute, but at that time it was primarily just Toronto Police Services, I believe. And it ties in also with the other story we talked about where inside the Attorney General's office in Ontario, there is a committee tasked with advising police, and I imagine they are all wrapped up in Project Resolute, or at least it's all one giant piece of the puzzle, right? What do you know about that now? And because it's gone beyond just Toronto, right? Like, and I'm glad that we're sharing this. And although 93, I imagine Toronto's been the hardest hit in terms of police oppression, but like I have no idea. Montreal, McGill, there were a lot of arrests. Like, do you have comparable figures? This must be replicated in other urban centers at the moment, to some degree.
I don't have a sense of those statistics, to be honest. I think there have been different things that we've seen, like early on, we saw in Calgary, specific like responses of police. And I also will say, like, part of the way in which they're operating with Project Resolute is like cloak and dagger secrecy. And there isn't clarity on who's doing what and who's coordinating with who. And it's the pieces that are clear is that policing forces across different, regardless of whether it's federal or provincial or local, police forces are coordinating with one another as to how to respond. And the
respond to what?
To the Palestine movement. To suppress it. Yes. Sorry.
How fucked
yes.
up does that sound?
I mean, insane, but Yeah.
For what? Okay,
You know,
keep going. I'm so sorry.
No, but I think it's a fair question. I mean, and so like they're coordinating with each other to suppress this, and then also there are parts that are like the federal giving orders to local police as to how to respond, and then like, or the city council doing that, and like different ways of decisions being made that are less about like, yeah, I mean, I think it's again like one of those pieces that there's also coordination. I mean, I'll speak more locally, but there's like, we know that there's coordination between the Crown and the police, for example. And so like
the Crown and the Toronto police?
Yes. And so I, just to say that it's like all these types of coordination is just to say that like the state is coordinating in all its levels. We don't have the details of that. But in reverse, we're trying to coordinate on our side to make sure that we have each other's backs, because that's as much as we can do. And I will say that like also in terms, there are questions that are, I know there, maybe Rachelle can speak to this a little bit more, but one of Israel's biggest exports is testing tactics on Palestinians and then exporting it to policing in countries like so-called Canada. And so that is another piece of it, of like our tactics. I mean, my assumption is that tactics that are being right now used on the Palestine movement will then be used against other movements. And this is important for every movement in the city, because soon it'll be housing and it'll be transit and it'll be everything else that people are fighting for using the same tactics. Because I think in thinking of a sinister, the armed force of the states, the way they think, this is a good test subject. This is a good way to see what would suppress people and what would make them move away from something they are ideologically aligned with. Like everybody who's in this movement is against the genocide and against the settler colonial project in Palestine and against imperialism. And so like, if you suppress them, then you can apply that model elsewhere. And that's my own theory. I haven't backed that elsewhere, but that's like what I assume they're doing.
Well, and we are seeing that at the micro level. Like the very, very small example is like the fucking truck at protests.
The
which,
Rebel
like,
News truck?
No. Our trucks.
Oh, yes, we've heard. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Our trucks, which, like, if you've ever gone to protests here in Toronto prior to 2023, we've always had speakers on trucks, like both like tech speakers. We've always had people on the back of trucks. This has never been an issue.
Like any
and
parade,
now suddenly
right?
it is a major issue. And we know what this is about. We know that like it's like strategic incapacitation, where the police are finding one minor thing that they can focus on, that they can then gain access to our movement spaces. So the fact that they need to like scrutinize the truck means that they get to enter protest spaces, means they get to like test out organizer discipline. Are people talking to the cops that shouldn't be talking to the cops? It's all a plan for them. But that truck thing has now applied to River Run. It has, I believe it applied to the Migrants' Rights March as well. Moving forward,
precedent has been set.
Our truck is the thing, which is so stupid. But I think also when we go back to how these settler colonial states are intertwined and learning from each other and sharing things from each other, there are things that get lost in sort of like the history. That in like 2008, Stockwell Day signed a public safety agreement with Israel, which would mean that Canada and Israel would share information on border control, prison population, and I believe crowd control. So that's 2008. It was a public agreement. It was a public declaration, I believe. It did not go through any sort of procedure in the House. And then it was reaffirmed in 2015. That's still there, which means also when we talk about links to settler colonialism and fascism, when you go to Canada's website about who is a international stakeholder on public safety, it's fucking Ben Giver, who is a fascist Israeli politician who actually, when Israeli soldiers were arrested for the rape of a Palestinian prisoner, this fucking politician decided that he was going to break down the prison doors to release them out. This is who the Canadian state has decided is a stakeholder on public safety.
I'm just mouthing the word trash. He's trash. Sorry. Yeah.
That's even kind of not.
I
He's
will.
beyond trash.
So I was trying to look up there was a Ricochet article that I wanted to send here in the chat that was about it's about the Canadian police chiefs meeting that they had in Halifax. And one of the things, and it's really like incredibly racist and fucked up in all types of different ways. They're trying to claim that police are now being doxxed online, which is laughably hilarious. And like their feelings, which is just like cry me a river.
Public safety officers, oh no, we know their names.
Yeah, like like it's so hard and painful for them. But the part that's interesting is like one of the Ontario Provincial Police Commissioner, one of the things that he says is that like individuals coming to Canada from the Middle East, from Middle Eastern countries where quote, the use of violence is an acceptable vehicle for social change, end quote. So just to say that there's also quite a bit of racism attached to this. I know we haven't touched on it. I think it's like an unspoken piece to this audience of this podcast, I assume, but like that's also alive and well, and underlines a lot of the narratives that TPS is funneling out to the media, and that the media is grabbing onto because it feeds into like an Islamophobic, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian sentiment, xenophobic sentiment that's just like these immigrants coming over, fucking everything up for us, when like these immigrants are saying we want to go home, but we want our home to be liberated, just at least for myself. I won't speak for the rest of my people, but but that is an interesting piece because it just like outlines also the anti-Indigenous racism that the journalist in that who wrote that piece experienced. But I think it's just also just to say like, the police chiefs coordinate with each other. They converse. They're not going to tell us how often they collaborate, but I would assume it's a lot. Like when you are a psychopathic fascist, you need others to stroke your ego, to be like, you're a good boy. And that's what's happening. And so like, sorry.
I flicked over to that article and I saw like victimized in quotes, and I just had to come back to the screen because I was going to start laughing, and I just can't deal with cops feeling like they're victims at this point after all that we've heard about their fucking behavior and their complicity.
And I will say it is like also like I think it's interesting, and we've seen this happen at least with Israel, but it's like a page out of their playbook to take the narratives that Palestinians are using to then as their own and repackage them. And it's like the TPS is doing the same thing where Israel will be like, we are indigenous to the land, but then they'll burn down the land, and they do and TPS is doing the same thing of like, our police are getting like minorly injured, but also we had hospitalized 8 people with like severe injuries. No, like that's the asterisk to all of it. So it's just like the playbooks are being exchanged with one another.
I just want to know, like, going back to the explicitly racist comments there, if you look at the mandate for the committee that I referenced earlier, and again, we did a whole episode on the Attorney General Committee, they are tasked with, examining protests that center on conflicts in the Middle East. So they didn't go as far as to say Palestine, because that would be super obvious, and I guess they can't use the word Palestine. They're using the CBC's language guide or something, but they explicitly do say that, anybody trying to stop conflicts in the Middle East is worth examining for hate crimes. And you tie that into the recent designation of a terrorist group, how that is expanding, and how likely that will then add a layer to the investigations around activists. Have you ever corresponded with this known terrorist group? And, then that adds to this hate crime level of charge that could be levied. So, yeah, we don't know exactly who's talking to who, but like you say, it's just so obvious that it's manufactured right from the top down. And that just flies in the face of all the checks and balances we're supposed to have. And I love it. Dalia's so flippant. Like, they won't even tell us how often they talk to each other, but we know. We know they meet up in their little caves and plot against us. But you sound a little crazy when you say it. But, like, it's the level to which the surveillance and the suppression of our form of democracy, like I say democracy, people think the ballot box. I mean, I'm assuming the listeners know who we're talking about, because when I said to you, like, respond to what? You said Palestinian protests, but, you know, they wouldn't apply this shit to any climate event. An indigenous-led one, sure. But if Greenpeace got, you know, I remember we had a big climate march, and it was huge. It was really fucking big, but we did nothing. We just walked down University, and we made a turn, and, like, they were cool. The state can deal with that, right? They can deal with us demanding a carbon tax or whatever the fuck we were asking for at that point. I don't even remember what the point was, what the demands were, but, like, they can kind of placate around that. But when those protests explicitly center on the colonial state, right, and a questioning of that use of state violence, all of that has to just, they've got to squash that as harshly as possible. If they know it's good for them.
Of course. And I will say, I think early on, like in the trends that we tracked, one of the things that we were kind of highlighting or seeing is this attempt at building a specific narrative of this idea of quote unquote good protesting versus quote unquote bad protesting. And that was like an not like clearly stated objective of the criminalization they were doing, but it was very obvious that they were trying to send a message to everybody who was, you know, coming out against the genocide to say, here are the ways in which we're okay with you protesting. Here are the ways in which you shouldn't protest because we will lay charges. And then that started to escalate where a lot more things face that. But that's also part of why I would say, like, we haven't seen so many arrests at protests, like at the mass mobilizations that happen at weekends, because those are quote unquote good. But then if it's a more direct action piece, then that is bad, and we need to teach you that that's quote unquote bad. And it's
she's
also,
using quotes for every time she says good and
yes,
bad, because I'm thinking, and I'm like, no, you're thinking it's the opposite. Like, we love our marches, but
yes,
like, it's called blueprints of disruption for a reason. So
exactly. And I think it's also just that also, you know, it's like you're saying about climate protesting. It's this idea that, like, come out and say the things, but don't actually disrupt the status quo and don't disrupt the flow of capital and don't disrupt, you know, everything that's happening. Don't inconvenience people too much, so to speak. But, like, in reality, the point of protest is to be disruptive and is to disrupt the flow of capital and to disrupt the status quo. And because you're asking for change, and change does not come when we, like, you know, we're not, like, you can't appeal to the morality of the state because they have no morality. Like, they're continuing their genocide on indigenous peoples of this land. What makes us think that they're going to care about the indigenous people of Palestine? Like, you know, like, it's not, it's this, like, you know what I mean? It's like a false equivalency.
Well, every industry does. It wouldn't even be, like, you know, nefarious to acknowledge that point, you know, that police chiefs across Canada, like, I mean, if you believe in police forces, they should be talking to one another in the hopes of doing their jobs better. We know that's not what they're doing. I mean, it is, because they do want to do their jobs better, and their job is to suppress our work, right? So, I mean, we would kind of mock them if they just lived in silos and operated without networking. I mean, we don't do that. No industry does. But I think just knowing that these tactics will likely just become more and more normalized, the less noise there is around them, which makes, you know, you coming on here to share these details so important. But it's like striking that balance between letting everybody know what the cops are doing and how you could possibly mitigate it, right? Rather than trying to stay in the lane they're trying to put you in, right? Because I think one of the most one of the things that hit me was when you mentioned the type of lawyer. And it was so black and white, like, or night and day there, the two approaches of maybe two different lawyers, where one would say, you know, lay low, don't talk to anyone, like typical lawyer advice. We've all kind of seen and heard it in the same movies where you're asking for, where's the warrant? But then you say a movement lawyer, and it's not just the movement lawyer, it is the movement, right? Where we add sunlight to things, and we are accountable to each other, and we are open facing as much as possible. And so, yeah, no, just mentioning that, like, it's a logistical thing. Like, when you get arrested, don't just call any fucking lawyer, right? Like, know that there are two different approaches you can definitely take. One is beneficial to the movement as a whole. One may protect you a little bit more, but in the end, it's arguable, right? It's arguable whether trying to deal with this on your own and trying to, just avoid those charges altogether is probably not in your best interest either. But so back to the balance. I go on tangents. That's the ADHD. But it's you want to share this, but you don't want people to be scared, right? So before I let you folks escape, do you have anything you could share with the audience who have heard all of these things? They are mad, but at the same time, we've planted a kernel of what you could likely expect should you engage in any meaningful way. So other than the kind of practical steps that you've provided, in terms of forming community support, having legal support, a know your rights education within circles, is super important, and adapting that to like practicality. Like, you'll have rights that are in the Constitution and on paper, and then you'll have the way the police are applying things. Because even like good or bad protests, that is shifting. Apparently Spider-Man costumes on awnings, like, that became a no-go all of a sudden, and like just like little like as you said, like, things just added to it. You'll have people saying, be safe, don't get arrested when you go out, and you look at them and you're going, I don't know what they arrest people for these days. That's changing all the time. Like, okay, like, that's just not even practical anymore. So what can you say to folks that are thinking, like, I want to go out, I don't want to get arrested, like, or
I think there are a few things to say. I think, like you said, I think there are know your rights that are really helpful and important to, information is power here, and to equip yourself with what you can do to protect yourself is important. Ways to protect your devices, wearing masks, doing these things is important. But also, I would say there are a few things. Like, I think the number of 94 is scary, and though it's not like the state is coming after people and the state is not arbitrarily arresting people. The movement has had tens of thousands of people in it, and the number is large, but the people who have not been arrested are larger. And so that's an important piece to highlight, is like, they're coming after people, and not because of who they are individually. That's a piece that, like, often when we connect with arrestees, we say, like, we'd say to them is like, this is very personal, and that it's happening to you, and you're the one that they're charging or trying to charge with these things. However, it's not about you at all. It's them trying to make an example of you more broadly. And so it's dehumanizing in that you no longer are an individual in that manner, but just to say that, like, they're doing this because they're trying to see what will freak people out. And again, the more knowledge we equipped ourselves with, the safer we can be to also, once there's an attempt to criminalize somebody, if you've done your due diligence and you've tried to have your own back, then a lawyer will take over and they'll have your back. And so I just think that there's quite also a bit of resources behind the movement and people who have set up structures to make sure that we are supported in the work that we're doing. And so I think that those are maybe the things that I would leave folks with.
And I would just echo everything that Dalia has said. And the thing is like, 94 is a lot, but that means we also have a very vibrant community of care for each other and with each other. And I would say, like, it's not the general, it is tens of thousands of people that are part of this movement, and only 94 have been arrested. Are we expecting more? Of course we are. And if that happens, will you be invited to this community of care and support and love? 100%. You will be a part of that. Like, you will not be alone in this. And I know the state and how, like, TPS releases these individualized reports, how the state individualizes your case, how they make it seem all individual. We continue to push back and be like, no, you're not alone. We are part of a collective. And that's just sort of part of the movement.
There's something so inherently powerful in that. where I just feel a little braver hearing it, honestly. And Musquassen had similar sentiments that really kind of stayed with me on, when she left being arrested and was greeted with like smokes and her favorite snacks. And it sounds like so small of a gesture, but in that moment where it did feel like all about you and you're probably doing everything you can to not freak out because you don't want to give the cops an inch, but internally it's so much stress. And then just to know that isn't, something you have to face with on your own. And even to think of it as a community you've joined to make such a positive out of it. I thank you so much for doing that kind of work, for taking that on. I was so disheartened when I asked Rachelle, like, do you think, eventually you'll be arrested too? Perhaps just because you're doing the work that you're doing. Not even necessarily the action they've arrested you for, and I expect it. And that made me mad. That made me mad that someone that's doing this work had to resign themselves to that and had to just operate with that in the back of your mind, but that neither of you have let it daunt you at all. I hope that gives our listeners the courage they need if they needed it. So thank you both very, very, very much. Not just for coming on the show, which I totally appreciate you taking the time out to do, because we will try to boost this as much as possible. People need to be talking about this, especially the investigating for hate crime. I can't believe the media didn't really pick up on that point. You named a couple other points that should have been blown up and that you folks spent time focusing on. But for me, that one is it's out there with every release. They don't even need somebody to tap them on the shoulder and be like, hi, they're doing this. They are getting that information with every press release, and they must surely go, well, why is it being investigated for a hate crime? No. And they just keep rolling, right? Or they do know, and they're not saying anything. So thank you for amplifying this too, on top of the work that you do, supporting, acting as legal support for those folks. And again, it's the Toronto Community Justice Fund that we are going to link at the very top of our show notes. If anybody has anything that they can donate to that, please do. But thank you, Dalia. Thank you, Rachelle. Yeah.
Thank you.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.